The letter hit the saloon floor before Delia Fairchild even realized she had dropped it. She stood in the middle of Harlan's saloon in Redemption, New Mexico territory, the year 1884, with every pair of eyes in the room locked onto her face, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the secret she had carried 1,200 miles from St. Louis had just been read aloud by a man she had never seen before in her life. The man holding the second copy of that letter, a thick-necked stranger in a brown coat with silver buttons, smiled at her the way a cat smiles at a mouse it has cornered under a floorboard. His name, she would learn later, was Royce Callum, and he had been hired by her former fiance, Edmund Hargrove, to find her and drag her reputation through the dirt of every town in the territory until she had nowhere left to run. "Says right here," Royce announced to the room, his voice carrying like a church bell, "that Miss Delia Fairchild of St. Louis, Missouri, is wanted for breach of contract, theft of engagement gifts valued at $460, and the willful abandonment of Edmund Hargrove, a respectable businessman and member of the St. Louis Commerce Society." He folded the letter slowly, deliberately, the way a man folds a winning hand. "Anyone harboring her does so at considerable legal risk." The silence that followed was the worst silence Delia had ever heard. It was thick and heavy and full of the particular cruelty that small communities reserve for people who arrive already broken. She felt it pressing against her chest like a boot heel. She had been in Redemption for exactly 4 days. She had already secured a position teaching at the school that the town's church committee was building. She had already begun to believe, foolishly, she now understood that she might actually survive this. Then a chair scraped back from a corner table. The man who stood up was tall. Not theatrically tall, not the kind of tall that announces itself, just the quiet, functional tallness of a man built for terrain and weather. He had dark hair that needed cutting and jaw that needed shaving and eyes the particular gray-green of sage after rain. He wore a plain canvas shirt, worn leather vest, and carried no visible weapon, which in Redemption in 1884 was either a statement of confidence or a declaration of recklessness. He walked to the center of the room and stopped beside Delia without looking at her. He looked at Royce Callum instead. "Breach of contract," he said, his voice unhurried, almost conversational. In New Mexico territory, a breach of contract claim requires filing in the 3rd Judicial District Court in Doña Ana County. "You got papers from that court?" Royce blinked. "I got a letter from. I didn't ask what you got from a private individual in Missouri," the man said. "I asked if you have filed papers in a territorial court. Because if you haven't, then what you just did is slander a private citizen in a public establishment, and that actually does have legal standing in this territory." Royce's smile faltered. "My name is Calvin Bristol," the man said. "I'm a licensed land surveyor for the territory of New Mexico, and I've had occasion to become familiar with how the law works out here. So I'll ask you one more time. Do you have territorial court papers?" Royce did not have territorial court papers. Everyone in the room could see it on his face. He tucked his letter back into his coat, muttered something about coming back with proper documentation, and walked out the door with the slightly deflated dignity of a man who had expected an easier afternoon. The room exhaled. Calvin Bristol picked up the letter from the floor, folded it neatly, and held it out to Delia without ceremony, without pity, and without the particular gleam of prurient curiosity that she had been bracing herself to see. "You'll want to keep that," he said quietly. "Know your enemy's document better than he does." She took it. Her hand was shaking. She hated that it was shaking. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out smaller than she intended. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "He'll be back." Men like that always are. He looked at her directly then for the first time, and she felt the weight of that gaze like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "I'd suggest you come have coffee at the cafe across the street and let me explain what your actual options are, unless you'd rather stand here while everyone in town finishes forming their opinions." She looked around the saloon. The opinions were already well underway. "Coffee," she said. Yes, she had come to Redemption to start over. She had not known, when she boarded the train in St. Louis with one trunk and a carefully constructed story, and a heart full of something that was equal parts terror and furious determination, that starting over would require quite so much of her. She had not known that the past had legs, that it could follow her across mountain ranges and desert flats and river crossings, and still arrive looking smug and well-rested in a New Mexico saloon. But that is where we need to go back to the beginning of Delia Fairchild's dark past, because no one arrives at a moment like the one in Harlan's saloon without a long and complicated road behind them. Delia had grown up in St. Louis, the second daughter of a pharmacist named George Fairchild, who was kind and intelligent and perpetually short of money. She had been educated at the city's female seminary until the money ran out at 16, and then she had educated herself through the public library and through the particular ferocity of a woman who refuses to accept that the ceiling is as low as everyone insists. By 22, she could speak passable French, had read every significant work of American jurisprudence she could find, kept meticulous accounts, and could teach mathematics through the 8th grade level with ease. She had also, at 22, made the catastrophic mistake of becoming engaged to Edmund Hargrove. Edmund had seemed like rescue when he arrived. He was 34, well-dressed, connected to the Commerce Society, and he had looked at Delia the way a collector looks at an unusual piece, with appreciation and with the implicit assumption of ownership. She had been too young, too exhausted by poverty, and too intoxicated by the idea of security to recognize the trap for what it was until she was already inside it. The trap had sprung slowly, the way the worst traps do. First, Edmund had begun managing her calendar, then her correspondence. Then her friendships, one by one, had been gently discouraged until they withered. By the time she understood that what Edmund offered was not partnership but possession, she had been engaged for 2 years, had accepted gifts totaling $460 by Edmund's calculation, which was a significant inflation of the actual figure, she would note, and had no independent income, no close friends remaining, and a reputation so thoroughly intertwined with Edmund Hargrove's social standing that leaving him seemed, from the inside, functionally impossible. What changed was a single evening in January of 1884. Edmund had come home. They did not yet share a home, but his house was the one she was expected to orbit in a particular mood. He had made clear, in language that left no ambiguity, what her life would actually look like once they were married. Not the comfortable security she had imagined, not the partnership she had hoped for despite all evidence to the contrary. Something considerably darker, something that involved doors that locked from the outside and correspondence that was reviewed before it was sent, and a social world that extended no further than Edmund decided it should extend. She had nodded and smiled through that conversation with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart beating very fast, and her mind working with the cold, rapid efficiency of a woman calculating a route of escape. She left 6 weeks later. She returned every gift she could physically carry. She left a letter acknowledging the remaining debt and stating her intention to repay it as she was able. She took the money she had saved, $63 hidden in a tin behind her mirror for 4 years, bought the least expensive train ticket that would put significant geography between herself and Edmund Hargrove, and arrived in New Mexico territory on a Tuesday in early March with one trunk, a teaching certificate from the St. Louis Female Seminary, which she had kept despite everything, and an absolute, ferocious refusal to become what Edmund had intended her to be. Redemption had not been her original destination. She had intended to go to Santa Fe, where she had read there were schools being established, and where the population was large enough that a woman alone might not draw quite so much attention. But the train had stopped at Redemption for mechanical repairs that stretched from 2 hours to 2 days, and in those 2 days Delia had walked the town, spoken with its residents, met the church committee that was establishing a school, and recognized in Redemption's particular combination of rough edges and genuine aspiration something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a place she might actually want to be. She had accepted the teaching position on a handshake. She had taken a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Alcott, who was sharp-eyed and decent and charged fair rates. She had begun to breathe. And then Royce Callum had walked into Harlan's saloon. The cafe across the street from the saloon was called Mabel's, and Mabel herself was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 who poured coffee with the quiet efficiency of someone who had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. She set 2 mugs on the table and withdrew without comment. Calvin Bristol wrapped both hands around his mug and studied Delia with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not pity. It was not the calculating interest of a man who had done her a favor and was tallying what he expected in return. It was something more like the focused attention of someone solving a problem that interested him. "How long have you been in Redemption?" he asked. 4 days. "Long enough for people to know you're here, but not long enough to have built any particular loyalty," he said, almost to himself. That's what he was counting on, a public reading before you had roots. "He works for my former fiance," Delia said. She was surprised by how steady her voice was. "In St. Louis. My former fiance is a man with resources and apparently a significant interest in making my life difficult. Because you left him. Because I left him." Calvin nodded slowly. "The gifts he's claiming you stole were gifts," she said, and she heard the controlled anger in her own voice. "Given freely over 2 years of engagement. I returned what I could carry. I left an acknowledgement of the remainder and an intention to repay. I have the copy I kept." She touched the folded letter in her coat pocket. "His figure is inflated. But even his figure, if I were formally found liable by a court, would amount to a debt I could conceivably repay. Teaching salary in a territory school is $18 a month, so it's not the money he wants." "No," she said, "it's not the money." Calvin looked at her for a moment and then looked down at his coffee. There was something in the set of his shoulders, not tightness exactly, but a kind of recognition that she noticed without knowing what to do with it. "He wants you back," Calvin said. "He wants me to have nowhere to go," she corrected. "He wants every town in the territory to know a version of me that makes it impossible to build a life, so that eventually I run out of options." And then she stopped. She pressed her lips together. "And then you come back," Calvin finished. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, through the cafe window, Delia could see Redemption going about its afternoon, a wagon pulling up to the general store, 2 men talking in front of the land office, a woman in a blue dress crossing the street with a basket over her arm. It was an ordinary scene. She had wanted so badly to be ordinary within it. "My grandfather came to Texas from Georgia after the war," Calvin said, unprompted, his eyes still on the window. "He had done something during the war that he was not particularly proud of. Not a crime, a moral compromise, the kind that comes from following orders when you should have refused. He moved as far west as he could get and spent 30 years building a life clean enough that he could look at himself in the morning." He looked at Delia then. "He used to say the West wasn't a place, it was a proposition, an agreement between you and the land that your past stayed east of where you were standing." Delia felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly, just enough. "That's a generous philosophy," she said. "It's a practical one," Calvin said. "The territory needs people who can teach. It needs people who can work and build and stay. It doesn't need to know every detail of where they came from." "Your man Royce Callum seems to disagree." "Royce Callum is a hired gun of a particular kind," Calvin said. "He makes his money breaking people before they can get established. He's good at it, but he's not invincible." He paused. "Do you want my help, or are you telling me your situation as a matter of polite conversation?" The directness of it startled her into an almost laugh. "You don't soften things much, do you?" "Takes longer," he said simply. She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the cafe window at an angle that caught the gray-green of his eyes, and she thought, with a small internal alarm, that he was a surprisingly compelling person to be sitting across a table from. She filed that thought away with firm intention to ignore it. "What kind of help are you offering?" she asked. "First, you need someone to vouch for your character in this town. That's immediate. The church committee is the relevant body since they control your employment. I know the committee chairman, a man named Aldous Greer, who is fair-minded if sometimes slow to it." He turned his mug in his hands. "Second, you need to understand the actual legal position Hargrove is in if he tries to pursue this through territorial courts. I wasn't bluffing to Callum, but I also simplified. The territorial court structure is real and Hargrove would need an attorney licensed in New Mexico, which takes time and money. You have more breathing room than you think." "And third?" she asked, because she could tell there was a third. He hesitated for the first time since she had met him. It was a small hesitation, but it was there. "Third," he said, "is that you shouldn't be doing this alone. Not in a town where you've been here 4 days and someone just made a public case against you in the local saloon." She looked at her coffee. "I've been doing things alone for some time." "I know," he said quietly. "That's not what I mean. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying you don't have to." She looked up at him, and for a moment the space between them felt like something she couldn't quite name, not dangerous exactly, but charged. The way the air gets before a summer storm that hasn't announced itself yet. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough," he said, "and I'm a good judge of what I don't know yet." Calvin Bristol, it turned out, had been in redemption for 3 years. He had come from Texas originally, as his grandfather's story implied, and before that from a brief and unhappy chapter in Denver that he mentioned exactly once and did not elaborate on. He was 31 years old. He had a small house at the edge of town near the creek, owned his surveying instruments outright, and had a contract with the Territorial Land Office that kept him steadily employed mapping the expanding boundaries of ranches and settlements and the occasional disputed property line. He was not the marshal. He was not the mayor. He had no official standing in redemption, beyond what his reputation had built through 3 years of showing up, doing what he said he would do, and demonstrating the particular kind of quiet competence that people in frontier communities learn to recognize and value because the alternative flashy unreliability costs lives. He spoke to Aldous Greer the following morning. Delia was not there for that conversation, but she learned its contents through Mrs. Alcott, who learned them through the general efficiency of small-town information transfer. Calvin had told Greer that he personally vouched for Delia Fairchild's character. He had told Greer that the claim made by Royce Callum had no legal standing in the territory. He had told Greer, apparently with some firmness, that if the church committee withdrew the teaching position based on unsubstantiated allegations made by a hired man, they would be doing the territory's schools a disservice and themselves no favors in terms of their own reputation for fairness. Aldous Greer was, as Calvin had described him, fair-minded if sometimes slow to it. He took 2 days, but on the second day he came to the boarding house and told Delia that her position was secure, that the committee stood behind her, and that he hoped she would be comfortable in redemption. When she told Calvin what Greer had said, he simply nodded as if the outcome had been the only reasonable one. "He's a good man," Calvin said. "He just needed time to get there, and you needed to push him." "I made a case," Calvin said. "That's different from pushing." They were standing outside the general store at the time, in the particular bright light of a New Mexico afternoon that makes everything look slightly more vivid than it actually is. Delia had come for chalk and a slate board for the schoolroom. Calvin had come for rope and nails, which he needed for a surveying project. They had arrived at the same moment and fallen into step with each other the way 2 people sometimes do when there is an ease between them that neither has fully admitted to yet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why did you stand up in that saloon?" She had been turning this question over for 2 days. "You didn't know me. You had no particular reason to involve yourself." He was quiet for a moment in the way she was already beginning to learn meant he was choosing his words carefully, not stalling but working. "I've seen that kind of thing before," he said finally. "A person trying to start fresh and someone from their past arriving with a weapon made of information, using a crowd against them." He paused. "It bothers me. It bothers me in a specific way that makes it hard to sit still." "Personal experience?" she asked, because his tone had something in it that was not abstract. He looked at her sidelong. "Something like that." She did not push. She recognized a boundary when she encountered one, and she respected it the way she wanted her own to be respected. But she filed it away, the way his voice had shifted, the way his jaw had done something complicated. And she thought about it later in her room at Mrs. Alcott's, lying on her narrow bed looking at the ceiling and listening to the night sounds of a territory town that was slowly, tentatively, becoming the place she lived. The school opened in the second week of April, in a building that smelled of fresh-cut pine and had 16 desks, and a wood stove, and a blackboard that had been brought all the way from Albuquerque on the back of a wagon. Delia stood in front of it on the first morning with 14 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old, in a dress she had pressed very carefully the night before, and felt something she had not felt in so long that she almost didn't recognize it. She felt like herself. It was a peculiar sensation after so many years of being carefully managed into someone else's version of who she should be. Standing in front of those 14 children with a piece of chalk in her hand, the authority in the room was simply hers, not borrowed or granted or conditional. It belonged to her competence and her preparation and her genuine care for what happened in that room. No one was going to review her lesson plans before they were delivered. No one was going to quietly redirect her curriculum towards subjects that were more ladylike. She was the teacher. This was her school. She was going to do it correctly. Royce Callum had not returned after the incident at the saloon, but she did not believe he was finished. She kept her copy of Edmund's letter. She kept a small journal of dates and events. She was not naive enough to think that the breathing room Calvin had described was permanent. What she had not anticipated was Calvin himself. He began appearing at the school in the early evenings, after the students had gone, ostensibly because the school was near his route back from whatever surveying work he had been doing that day, and she was often still there grading exercises or preparing the next day's lessons. They began talking. At first, it was practical questions about the school, about the students, about how the territorial school system worked and what resources were available. But practical conversations, when two intelligent people are having them, have a way of expanding. She learned that he had studied at the University of Texas for 2 years before the money ran out, and he had taught himself the rest mathematics, geometry, cartography through books and practice. She learned that he had been briefly married in Denver, and that the marriage had ended in a way he described as mutual, and that she understood from the particular economy of his description to mean something more complicated and painful than mutual, though she did not press. She learned that he kept a small collection of books in his house, mostly history and natural science, and a few novels that he seemed faintly embarrassed about, and that he read in the evenings because the territory nights were long and the alternative was sitting in the saloon, which he found less interesting than his books. He learned about her in the way that she revealed things, not all at once, not in a confessional rush, but in pieces, each piece offered after she had considered it and decided it was safe. He accepted each piece without making it into more than it was, without immediately building theories or drawing conclusions, just absorbing it and asking the occasional clarifying question that showed he had understood what she meant, not just what she said. It was the most unusual intimacy she had ever experienced. One evening in late April, he brought her a book. It was a battered copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which he said he had read twice and thought she might find interesting for reasons that he didn't fully explain, but that she found when she read it she understood. The monster, she thought, the hidden self. The thing created by circumstances trying to be understood on its own terms. She brought the book back to him 2 weeks later with a note tucked into the front cover. The note said, "I understood what you meant. The monster just wanted to be seen clearly. So did I." He folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of his vest without saying anything, and she knew, with a certainty that settled into her chest like warm stone, that he had kept it there. May in redemption was extraordinary. The desert was doing something that Delia had not expected desert to do. It was blooming. Wildflowers she didn't know the names of appeared along the creek bank and in the arroyos and even in the dust at the edges of the main road. The evenings were long and golden, and the air smelled like sage and something sweet she couldn't identify. She began taking walks after supper, and Calvin began appearing on these walks, initially with an air of coincidence that she did not believe and did not challenge, because the company was good. They walked along the creek, and he told her the names of the plants and the geology of the formations in the distance, the way the land had been shaped by ancient water and wind and upheaval. He spoke about the territory with the specific love of someone who had chosen it rather than been born into it, the love that is more articulate because it came from recognition rather than habit. She told him about St. Louis. She told him about the library and the books and the years of educating herself while appearing, on the outside, to be simply a pleasant young woman of limited prospects. She told him about her parents, who had been kind and limited by poverty and who had both died, her mother of cholera when Delia was 15, her father of simple exhaustion 3 years later, worn out by a life that had asked more than it had given. She told him about Edmund. Not all of it at once, never all at once, but piece by piece, the architecture of it, how it had begun, how the trap had been constructed so gradually she hadn't seen it until she was already inside it, how she had sat in Edmund's parlor with her hands in her lap and her heart running very fast and her mind already planning the exit. How she had felt, boarding that train, a terror so complete it had a physical texture, and underneath the terror, something harder and cleaner that she had learned to call her own will. Calvin listened to all of it with the particular stillness she had come to think of as his natural mode, not passive, not absent, but fully present and not performing anything. When she finished a piece of the story, he didn't immediately offer comfort or condemnation. He often just sat with it for a moment, as if making room for the weight of it before he responded. One evening, when she had told him more than she intended to about the night when Edmund had described what their married life would actually look like, he was quiet for a long time. They were sitting on the bank of the creek, and the water was doing its quiet nighttime business around the rocks, and the sky above was doing the impossible thing that territory skies do, turning 17 colors in the space of 40 minutes. "He was afraid of you," Calvin said finally. She looked at him. "Men like that," he said. "The control isn't about love, it's about fear. He could see that you were more than he could hold and he was trying to reduce you to a size that didn't frighten him." He paused. "It's a particular kind of cowardice." He wouldn't describe it that way. "No," Calvin agreed. "He'd describe it as love." She looked back at the creek. Something moved in her chest, a shift like ice breaking up on a river in spring, not dramatic but fundamental. "You have a way of naming things accurately," she said. "Occupational habit," he said, with the particular almost smile that she had catalogued carefully. "Surveyors are very precise about where things actually are as opposed to where someone claims they are. Is that what you're doing, surveying me?" He looked at her then, and the almost smile became something more complex. "I'm paying attention," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Surveying is about establishing fixed points," he said. "Attention is about—" He stopped. He seemed to be considering something. "Attention is about wanting to know more." She felt the warmth of that land on her like the late evening sun. She did not look away from him. There was something between them now that had been building for weeks with the patience of something natural, a river finding its course, not dramatic but inevitable, and she could feel it pressing at the edges of whatever careful distance they had been maintaining. "Calvin," she said. "Yes." "Are you—" She stopped. She tried again. What is this? What are we doing walking by this creek every evening? He held her gaze steadily. I think you know what it is, he said quietly. I think I do too, she said. She pressed her hands together in her lap. I'm not very good at trusting it. The last time something felt like this, it turned out to be a trap. I know, he said. And I would never insult you by telling you to simply trust it anyway. You've earned your caution. It's reasonable. He paused. What I will tell you is that I have no hidden motive here. I don't want anything from you that you haven't freely chosen to give. And his jaw did the complicated thing again. I'm not going anywhere. That's all I can offer you right now. Just that I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long time. The creek went on with its quiet business. The sky had finished its performance and settled into deep blue with the first stars appearing. That's actually quite a lot, she said finally. Good, he said. And then very quietly, he reached over and covered her hands with one of his, and they sat like that until the dark came all the way down. There were, of course, complications. This is the Wild West and the year is 1884, and things are not permitted to be simple. Royce Callum came back in the second week of May, and this time he had brought a companion, a man who introduced himself as Franklin Bates, attorney at law, admitted to the bar in Missouri. Franklin Bates was a thin man of about 45 with the hollow-cheeked look of someone who had drunk too much coffee for too many years, and the careful wardrobe of a man who considered appearance a professional tool. They came to the school. Delia was in the middle of an arithmetic lesson when they appeared in the doorway, and she felt the familiar cold wash of fear move through her, and then she felt something else move through behind it, something that had been growing in her since that first evening at Mabel's cafe, something with the particular texture of a woman who has decided to stop running. She told the children to work the problems on their slates, and she walked to the door. Miss Fairchild, Franklin Bates said pleasantly. I represent Mr. Edmund Hargrove of St. Louis, Missouri. I'd like to speak with you at your convenience about a matter of, you're interrupting my school day, she said. My convenience is at 4 o'clock at the boarding house where I reside. If you have legally filed documents for the territorial court, bring those. If you have a letter from a private citizen in Missouri, I've already read it and you may keep yours. She went back inside and closed the door. Her hands were shaking again, but she had done it. She had met them at the door and sent them away and gone back to teaching fractions, and that, she thought, was what starting over actually required. Not the absence of fear, not the guarantee of safety, just the decision made repeatedly to keep going anyway. Calvin was at the boarding house at 4 o'clock. She had not asked him to come. He simply appeared, as he had a way of doing, as if his internal compass was oriented in her direction, and he moved accordingly. He stood slightly behind and to the right of her, not in front, not between her and Bates, but present, available, a witness to the fact that she was not alone. Franklin Bates did, in fact, have territorial court documents this time. Hargrove had moved faster than Calvin had expected, had hired a local attorney to file in Doña Ana County, alleging theft of property. It was a civil suit. It was real. The amount claimed was $460. After Bates left, Delia sat down in Mrs. Alcott's front parlor and looked at the papers. Calvin sat across from her. This is real, she said. Yes, he said. I can't pay $460, not in any reasonable time frame. Teaching salary would take over 2 years of your entire income, he said. Yes, I know. He knows that, she said. The anger was very clean and cold in her chest. He knows I can't pay it. He doesn't want the money. He wants the judgment against me so he can use it. So he can say to the next town and the town after that that I've been found legally liable, that I'm a thief. Yes, Calvin said. Then the documents serve his purpose whether or not the court ever actually rules. Yes, she looked at him. You're not telling me it's all right. It's not all right, he said. It's genuinely difficult, I see that. What do I do? He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. You defend it. You respond to the court filing within the required period, 30 days, and you contest the claim. You produce your own accounting of the gifts. What they were, what you returned, what the actual value of the remainder was. You produced the letter you left acknowledging the remainder. You established that you did not steal anything you left, which is not the same as theft, and you made written acknowledgement of any remaining debt. I need an attorney. There is one in town, Albert Rooney. He's not Franklin Bates, but he's competent and he's honest, which in this particular case is more valuable. She was quiet for a moment. This will cost money I don't have. I know, Calvin said. He looked at her steadily. I can lend it to you, not as a gift. A loan with terms we agree on, repaid when you're able. No pressure and no conditions. She felt something fierce rise in her throat. I won't take charity. I said loan, he repeated, with the patient precision of a man who means his words exactly. Charity is given with the expectation of gratitude. A loan is a financial transaction between equals. I know the difference. She pressed her lips together hard. Why are you doing this? He held her gaze, and this time there was something fully open in his eyes, something he wasn't moderating or measuring, just letting be there. Because you matter to me, he said, and I think I matter to you. And that means when you have a problem, it's not a problem I can sit comfortably with my hands in my pockets. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the letter tucked in the inside pocket of his vest. She thought about the creek bank and the 17 colors of the sky and his hand over hers in the dark. She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly, the way the monster in the book had just wanted to be seen, and how this man had been seeing her clearly since a saloon afternoon when he didn't know her at all. Loan, she said. Written terms, agreed upon together. Agreed, he said immediately. Albert Rooney turned out to be a wiry man of about 55 with an unexpectedly meticulous legal mind, and a deep personal irritation with out-of-state attorneys who came to the territory assuming the local bar would simply fold. He reviewed Delia's documents, her journal of dates and events, and her letter of acknowledgement from the night she left St. Louis, and he told her that Hargrove's case was significantly weaker than it appeared. The primary problem with Hargrove's claim, Rooney explained, was the question of what constituted theft under either Missouri or territorial law. Theft required taking property without consent. Gifts given freely over a 2-year period were, by legal definition in most jurisdictions, the property of the recipient. The question of whether engagement gifts reverted to the giver upon dissolution of the engagement was unsettled law even in Missouri, and in New Mexico territory it was entirely unsettled, meaning the court would be making essentially new law. He's gambling, Rooney said, that you won't fight. That the cost and complexity of fighting will make you settle. A settlement where you pay something, anything, becomes an admission of his version of events. Then we don't settle, Delia said. Rooney looked at her. It will take time. It won't be comfortable. I'm familiar with discomfort, she said. What do you need from me to respond to the filing? Rooney filed the response in Doña Ana County in the 3rd week of May. Delia provided a detailed accounting of every gift she had received, what she had returned, and what remained, along with the letter she had left. She also, at Rooney's suggestion, provided sworn statements from 2 residents of St. Louis, women she had known before Edmund's influence had dismantled her friendships, who wrote, in careful legal language, that the gifts in question had been presented publicly as unconditional gifts of affection, and that the value Edmund claimed was significantly overstated. Those letters had required writing to St. Louis and waiting 3 weeks for a reply, and an additional week for the postal service to deliver them back. They had arrived on a Wednesday, and Delia had sat on the edge of her bed and read them and cried with a completeness that surprised her, because she had thought those friendships were gone, and they were not. They were just dormant, waiting for the ice to break up. Calvin was not there when she read those letters, but she told him about it the next evening on the creek bank, and he listened with the stillness that was his particular form of presence. And when she was done, he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "You built that, those friendships. He tried to take them away, and they came back because you built them in the first place. People surprise me, she said. People are often better than the loudest voices about them would suggest, he said. She looked at him in the evening light, and something she had been holding very carefully for weeks shifted definitively. She reached out and touched his jaw just briefly, just the back of her fingers against the rough of his unshaved face. He went very still, as if afraid to break something. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He turned his face slightly into her hand, just barely, just enough. "You did the hard parts," he said quietly. "I just made sure you had somewhere to put your feet while you were doing them." That was when she kissed him. It was not tentative or confused. She had been a woman who second-guessed her own instincts for too long, and she was done with that particular habit. She kissed him the way she had learned to teach, with full commitment, fully present, in complete confidence that she was doing the right thing. He kissed her back with a care that made her feel precisely as she had always deserved to feel, as if she were something worth being careful with. When they separated, the sky was doing its evening performance again, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the quiet was the comfortable kind. "I need to tell you something," he said eventually. "All right." He was quiet for a moment. "My marriage in Denver, the thing I described as mutual." "Yes. My wife," he stopped, started again. "Her name was Clara. She was from a good family in Denver. We married young. I was 24, she was 22, and I thought at the time it was what I wanted, what I was building toward. I had the surveying practice. I was doing well. We had a house." He paused. "She had a dark past, too. Something she hadn't told me before we married. She had been involved with someone before, a man who had treated her badly, and she had not recovered from it the way she appeared to have recovered from it. It came out gradually, the way these things do. She was unhappy in ways I couldn't reach. She was frightened in ways that had nothing to do with me but that I couldn't fix, and that were—" he pressed his lips together. "She left eventually, went back to Denver, went back to her family. I heard later she married someone else and was doing better." He paused. "I don't say this to create symmetry between us. I say this because I want you to know that I know something about what it means to have a chapter that shaped you in ways you're still working out." Delia looked at him. "You loved her." "I cared for her very much," he said. "Whether that was love in the way that word should be used, I'm less certain." He looked at her. "I know what I feel now is more alive than anything I felt in Denver. That much I'm sure of." She reached for his hand and held it. "Thank you for telling me. You told me your hard things," he said simply. It seemed right. The court hearing in Doña Ana County was scheduled for July. It was a 6-hour ride by horse to the county seat, and Albert Rooney made the journey twice for preliminary proceedings. Delia went for the final hearing herself, riding in a hired wagon with Rooney, and because he said he had business at the land office in the same county, which she suspected was only partly true. Calvin. Franklin Bates was there, sharp-suited and prepared. Edmund Hargrove had not made the journey from St. Louis, which Rooney took as a positive indicator. Men confident in their cases tend to show up for them. The hearing before Judge Cornelius Abbott lasted most of a morning. Rooney presented Delia's accounting, the affidavits from St. Louis, the letter of acknowledgement she had left, and a careful legal argument about the definition of theft in the context of dissolved engagements. Bates presented Hargrove's accounting, his letter, and a general argument about the moral obligation of an engaged woman to return gifts upon abandoning her betrothed. Judge Abbott was a man of about 60, with the look of someone who had heard a great many arguments and had developed strong filters for the ones that were primarily moral theater rather than legal substance. He asked Delia one direct question. "Miss Fairchild, did you take the property described in the plaintiff's filing with the intent of permanently depriving Mr. Hargrove of it?" "No, Your Honor," she said. "I took items that had been given to me as gifts over 2 years of engagement. I returned what I could carry on the night I left. I left a written letter acknowledging the remainder and stating my intent to repay any legitimate claim. My intent was to leave, not to steal." Judge Abbott looked at the papers for a long moment. He ruled in Delia's favor. The written opinion, which Rooney received 3 weeks later, was careful and precise. The gifts in question had been given as unconditional gifts during the engagement period. The dissolution of the engagement did not retroactively convert them to loans or deposits. The plaintiff had demonstrated no criminal intent. The claim was dismissed with prejudice. With prejudice, meaning Edmund Hargrove could not bring this specific claim again. Delia read the opinion 3 times sitting at the kitchen table in Mrs. Alcott's boarding house. Then she put it down and sat very quietly for several minutes, feeling something move through her that she recognized only slowly, and then with great emotion as the particular sensation of a weight being set down. Not all the weight of memory and wariness, and the habits of caution that Edmund had installed in her would take years to fully dismantle, and she was honest enough with herself to know that. But this specific weight, the legal threat, the tool that had been built to chase her across the territory, that was gone. Calvin came over that evening. She showed him the opinion. He read it and looked up at her, and the expression on his face was so warm and unguarded that she felt it physically, like sun on skin. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like someone who just won a fight they shouldn't have had to fight," she said, "which is partly satisfying and partly," she paused, "partly still a little angry." "That's exactly right," he said. "Hold both of those." She smiled at him. She crossed the room to where he was sitting and she put her hands on his face, both hands, and she looked at him carefully. He held very still, watching her. "I came to this territory to start over," she said quietly. "I had a plan for what that would look like. My plan did not include any of this." She traced her thumb along his jaw. "It did not include you." "Plans rarely include the best things," he said softly. "I'm falling in love with you," she said directly, because she was done second-guessing her own instincts. "I want you to know that, clearly, without ambiguity." He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them the gray-green of them was something she felt she could have spent a great deal of time studying. "I've been in love with you since Mabel's Cafe," he said. "When you said the man didn't want the money, he wanted you to have nowhere to go. I thought that is the clearest thinking I have ever heard about a situation while it's happening to you, and then I was finished." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from the actual center of her. "That's an extraordinary thing to fall in love with someone over." "It's exactly the right thing," he said. "I fell in love with how your mind works. The rest of it," he touched her hair very gently, "the rest of it only made it worse." She kissed him then with the particular joyfulness of a woman who has decided she is allowed to be happy and is, at this exact moment, genuinely happy, and he kissed her back with everything he had been holding carefully for the month since that first afternoon. And outside the boarding house window redemption went on with its business, indifferent to the profound shifts happening in Mrs. Alcott's kitchen. The summer moved like a river over familiar stones, smooth and quick. The school term extended through July with additional students, as families continued arriving in the territory. Delia expanded her curriculum, added a Friday afternoon session for adult literacy that drew 7 students ranging from 19 to 63, and wrote to the territorial school board about resources for second-year operations. She got most of what she asked for. She was learning that specific, well-reasoned requests in writing were effective, that the territory was not hostile to competence, only to passivity. Calvin's surveying contract expanded. 2 new settlements were going up north of Redemption, ranches being claimed and established along the creek systems, and the land office needed accurate maps. He was often out for several days at a stretch, sleeping in the field with his instruments and his notebooks, and Delia found that she missed him with a specificity that was new to her. Not the anxious, dependent missing of someone who needed another person to feel safe. The clean, straightforward missing of someone who simply preferred the world with a particular person in it. He brought her things from the field. A piece of rose quartz from a formation north of the creek. A dried flower she didn't know the name of that he had pressed in his survey notebook between 2 pages of calculations. A feather from a hawk he had watched for an hour one morning from a hill above a canyon. She arranged these things on the windowsill of her room at Mrs. Alcott's, and Mrs. Alcott, who noticed everything, said nothing but smiled to herself in the particular way of a woman who approves of a development without feeling the need to announce it. In August, Calvin asked her to walk out with him on a Sunday afternoon, which was not unusual, except that he walked her in a direction she hadn't been north of town, up along a rise where the scrub pine began to thicken, and the air was slightly cooler and you could see Redemption below, the rooftops catching the late summer light. There was a building site there. Just the foundation and some framing so far, but she could see the footprint, larger than necessary for one person, with the specific placement of windows that indicated someone had thought about where the light would come through at different times of day. She stopped. She looked at it. She looked at him. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and he was watching her with an expression she had learned to read as the one he wore when something mattered enough that he was afraid of misreading the moment. "I filed the land claim 6 months ago," he said, before he paused, "before I knew whether you'd stay." "But after the saloon," she said. "Yes," he held her gaze. "I need you to know that I'm not asking you anything right now that requires you to say yes. What I'm asking is whether this is something you might want, whether I'm someone you might want to build with, not because you need to, not because the alternative is difficult, because you want to." She looked at the framing. She could see very clearly where the rooms would be. She could see the window over what would be the kitchen table, the way the morning light would come through it. She could see, with the particular clarity of a woman whose mind had always worked in complete, detailed pictures, what a life in that house might actually look like. "It needs a room that faces east," she said. "For a classroom if the school ever closes or if I want to teach privately." He stared at her. "You want a schoolroom in the house. A study at minimum, possibly a proper classroom. The east wall gets the morning light." The expression on his face shifted from careful watchfulness to something entirely unguarded, something that might, in another man, have produced tears, but in Calvin produced instead the full, actual smile that she had been working toward for months, and that, now that she was seeing it without the almost, was even better than she had been expecting. "We can put it on the east side," he said. "It'll require reconfiguring the—" He stopped. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and cupped her face in both hands and looked at her with everything right there on the surface. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she said. "That is absolutely, unambiguously a yes." He kissed her in the late August light on a hillside above Redemption, and the territory stretched out around them in all directions, enormous and unheld and full of possibility, and she felt it. The proposition, the agreement between a person and the land, her past staying east of where she was standing open up around her like a room she had finally been given the key to. They were married in October, on a Saturday, in the church that was still slightly under construction. The steeple was going up the following week with Aldous Greer officiating, because his committee had paid for the building, and he felt entitled to the honor. Mrs. Alcott sat in the front row and cried without apology. Albert Rooney attended and brought his wife, who brought a cake she had made from dried apricots and honey that was the best thing Delia had ever tasted. Mabel came, and the 2 women from the church committee who had quietly championed Delia when the school was first established, and 7 of her adult literacy students, and 14 schoolchildren who had mostly been dragged by their parents but who seemed to find the whole event more interesting than the expected arithmetic. Calvin wore his good dark coat, and the vest that Delia had discovered contained in its inside pocket, pressed flat, her note from the Shelley novel. She had found it when she was helping him pack for a survey trip in September, and had held it, and felt something so warm and particular that she had very carefully replaced it exactly as it was without saying anything. She wore a dress that had been her mother's, worked over and altered by Mrs. Alcott's precise hands, until it fit the woman Delia had become rather than the woman her mother had been. It was deep blue wool with ivory buttons, practical for a territory October, and she wore her hair up with a few flowers from the creek bank that Calvin had picked that morning and brought to her door without ceremony, which was the most romantic thing she had ever experienced. He looked at her when she came down the stairs of the boarding house, and the expression on his face was the one she would remember for the rest of her life. Complete, quiet, utterly certain, looking at her the way you look at something you have been waiting for and are only now allowing yourself to fully acknowledge has arrived. The ceremony was short. The vows were the traditional ones, though Delia had asked to add a line to see each other clearly and to be seen, and Greer had raised his eyebrows slightly, and then included it without further comment, because he was, as Calvin had said, a fair-minded man. They moved into the house on the hill in November, when the framing was complete and the roof was solid, and the east-facing room had its window installed, and a small iron stove that would, as Delia intended, make it perfectly comfortable for reading and thinking and eventually teaching, if that was what the room became. The furniture was spare, what Calvin owned, what Delia owned, which wasn't much, and a few pieces they built themselves over the winter with wood from the local mill, and the basic joinery that Calvin had learned from his grandfather in Texas. Winter in Redemption was cold but not brutal. They had enough wood, enough food laid in from the fall, enough books between them to last considerably past spring. The evenings were long in the Territory winter way, and they spent them at the kitchen table reading or talking or playing cards with a deck that had belonged to Calvin's grandfather, and that was missing the 7 of diamonds, which created interesting problems in certain games. She began receiving letters from her 2 friends in St. Louis. Not the careful legal letters of the court proceedings, but real letters, full of their lives and their news and the easy intimacy of women who have rediscovered a friendship they thought was gone. She wrote back at length. She had a good deal to tell them. One letter in December contained a piece of news she had not expected. Edmund Hargrove had married, a woman from a Chicago family with money of her own, which Delia thought was an interesting choice on Edmund's part. Either he had become a different person, which she doubted, or he had made a miscalculation about how well that particular approach would work with a woman who had her own financial independence, which she suspected time would reveal. She told Calvin about it at supper that night, and he listened and then said quietly, "How do you feel about that?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to do. She paused. "I feel nothing very strong, a certain relief that he's moved on, some sympathy for the woman which I recognize I may not owe her but which I can't help." She looked at Calvin across the table in their kitchen with the wood stove going and the evening dark outside and the Territory quiet around the house, and a very specific, very strong gladness that I am here and not there. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Agreed," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. Spring came to the Territory the way it always did, dramatically and with the quality of an announcement. The wildflowers returned along the creek. The school term resumed. Delia's adult literacy class had grown to 12 students over the winter. Word had spread in the way that genuinely useful things spread in small communities, through people who had benefited telling people they knew, and she had begun writing a curriculum document that she intended to send to the Territorial School Board, arguing for formal adult education programs. She was also, by April, pregnant. She knew before she was certain, the way women often know, the specific alteration in the body's ordinary business that announces something extraordinary. She told Calvin on an evening in late April, not formally, not with ceremony, just matter-of-factly across the kitchen table, because that was how they told each other important things. He sat very still for a moment. Then he got up from the table and came around to her side and held her with the specific care of a man who understood he was holding more than one thing, and she felt his hands against her back and his face in her hair, and the particular quality of his breathing that she had learned, over months, to read. This was the breathing of a man feeling something that was too large for words, and that he was simply sitting inside of without trying to make it smaller. "Are you well?" asked finally. "I'm well," she said. A little tired, a little she smiled. A little astonished. "A little astonished seems like the correct response," he said. "How do you feel?" she asked, tilting her head back to look at him. He looked at her with those clear gray-green eyes and said, "Like I want to build you a better chair for the classroom so you can sit when you need to." She laughed and felt the laugh in her whole body. "That is the most practical declaration of impending fatherhood I have ever heard." "I'll also feel everything else," he said seriously. "The enormous thing. I just lead with the practical because the enormous thing needs a minute." "Take your minute," she said, and tucked her face against his chest. The boy was born in December of 1885, healthy and loud, and opinionated about his circumstances in the way that certain people announce themselves immediately. They named him George Calvin Bristol, George for Delia's father and Calvin for his own father's tradition of passing names forward, which in Calvin's family had been a minor obsession. George had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, which were brown and intelligent, and by the time he was 4 weeks old, were fixed on things with the kind of sustained attention that made Delia suspect he would be a reader. Calvin built the improved chair for the classroom. He also added a second room to the house over the winter, working on weekends with lumber from the mill and help from 2 neighboring ranchers he had surveyed for the previous spring, and the room was finished by February, just as George was beginning to find his opinions about the world more interesting than his opinions about his own discomfort. The school had grown. Redemption had grown. By 1886, there were 31 students in the schoolroom that had been built for 16, and Delia was writing to the school board with some firmness about additional resources and a second teacher. The board was responsive. She had earned, through 3 years of written communication with them, a reputation as someone whose requests were specific and whose outcomes were measurable. A second teacher arrived in spring of 1886. A young woman named Frances Hollies, recently certified from a school in Albuquerque, 23 years old and somewhat overwhelmed by Redemption's particular combination of enthusiasm and roughness. Delia took her in hand with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned, through hard experience, exactly what a woman needed to get established in a territory town. Frances turned out to be capable and steady, and to have a dry wit that made Delia genuinely like her. Calvin's surveying practice had expanded sufficiently by 1886 that he had taken on an assistant, a young man of 20 named Thomas Vigil, who was part of a family that had been in the territory for 3 generations before New Mexico became a territory at all, and who had the particular competence that comes from growing up in a landscape and understanding it bodily before you understand it intellectually. Calvin taught Thomas the formal mathematical and cartographic side. Thomas taught Calvin things about the terrain and the water patterns and the relationship between certain plants and certain soil types that Calvin's books had not addressed. It was a good partnership. They surveyed together most of the spring and summer of 1886, and Delia noticed that Calvin came home from these weeks with a particular quality of contentment. Not just the satisfaction of work done, but the specific satisfaction of work done with someone you've taught and who has taught you back. "He's exceptional," Calvin told her one evening, talking about Thomas. "He sees things in the landscape that take me 20 minutes of calculation to identify. He's already doing it intuitively." "You should pay him what he's worth," Delia said. Calvin looked at her. "I do." "Good," she said. She was grading exercises at the kitchen table while George slept in his cradle near the stove, and she looked up from the papers. "There are too many people in this territory doing excellent work for wages that don't reflect it." "I know," Calvin said. "I've been thinking about bringing Thomas in as a formal partner when he's ready. Equal stake." She looked at him. "When are you going to stop surprising me?" "Hopefully never," he said, and went back to his book. The spring of 1887 brought 2 things of significance. The first was that Frances Hollies married a rancher named David Prescott, who lived 8 miles north of Redemption, and showed every sign of being happy about it. The wedding was a loud and cheerful affair at the rebuilt church. The steeple had been completed in 1885 and had so far survived 2 substantial windstorms, and Delia stood with Calvin at the edge of the gathering, watching Francis and David dance to the music of a fiddle and a harmonica, and felt the particular warm happiness of someone who has helped build something good. "You got her established," Calvin said quietly. "She got herself established," Delia said. "I just made sure she had somewhere to put her feet." He looked at her, then with a sideways expression that held something she recognized, the echo of his own words back to her, from that first year, from the creek bank and the saloon and the enormous, complicated beginning of everything. She saw that he recognized it too. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and neither of them said anything else because there was nothing that needed saying. The second thing that spring was a letter from her friend in St. Louis, one of the 2 women who had sent the affidavits for the court case. Her name was Vera, and she had been Delia's closest friend before Edmund's slow work of isolation had separated them. The letter said that Vera was coming west, not to Redemption specifically, but to the territory. Her husband had a business opportunity in Albuquerque, and they were making the move in the summer. Could Delia recommend a route? Could Delia recommend resources? Could Delia, in fact, be expected to visit? Delia sat down and wrote the most comprehensive letter she had ever produced, 12 pages covering everything from the best train route to the specific stores in Albuquerque that could supply what a woman needed to set up a household. She included a standing invitation to Redemption. She sealed it and gave it to Calvin to post the next morning, and when she handed it over she felt, again, the specific sensation of a weight being set down, not trouble this time, but distance. One more piece of the life she had thought she'd lost coming back to find her. Calvin posted it. He also, without mentioning it, included a separate note of his own to Vera's husband about the land situation in Albuquerque, and what a reliable attorney there looked like. Because that was the kind of man he was, thoroughgoing and practical and attending to things before they needed attending to. George walked for the first time in February of 1887, at 14 months, with the determined, slightly furious concentration of a person who has decided to figure something out and is not interested in help. He walked from the kitchen table to the wood stove, a distance of about 6 feet, and then sat down hard and looked at his parents with an expression of complete self-satisfaction. Calvin laughed, a full, genuine laugh that Delia collected in her memory because it was one of the best sounds she knew. They began talking, that winter, about a second child. Not urgently, not with pressure, but with the easy openness that had become the texture of how they discussed anything important. Delia was 30, Calvin was 33. They were in good health. The house was solid and had been expanded twice and could accommodate more people without strain. The school was stable and Francis's partial replacement, a young man from Las Cruces named Henry Ortega, also certified, also capable, was working well. There was no practical obstacle. More than the practical, though, Delia found that she wanted it. She had thought for a long time that the wanting of things was dangerous, that desire was the thing Edmund had tried to control, and therefore the thing she should keep hidden even from herself. But Calvin had been dismantling that habit with the patient precision of a man who understands that damage is real but not permanent, that you can fix broken things if you approach them honestly and don't rush. She wanted a second child. She told him so. He said he wanted that too, and she trusted that he meant it simply, without agenda, without hidden motive, because Calvin Bristol did not have hidden motives. It was one of the things she loved most about him, the radical, sometimes startling straightforwardness of a man who had decided that honesty was the most efficient way to live. The second child was a girl. They had discussed names with the same thoroughness they brought to everything, and had settled on Ellen Mary Bristol Ellen for Calvin's grandmother, who had been a woman of considerable practical intelligence by all accounts, and Mary for a general principle of continuity that appealed to Delia without her being entirely able to explain why. Ellen arrived in January of 1888, considerably more serene in her arrival than her brother had been in his, with her mother's dark hair, and it seemed to Calvin, her grandfather George's hands, wide-palmed and long-fingered. George was 2.5 and treated Ellen with the cautious fascination of someone encountering a new and not entirely explicable phenomenon. He sat near her cradle for long periods and watched her with those intelligent brown eyes, occasionally offering objects for her consideration. A spoon, a piece of quartz from the windowsill, a corner of his own blanket. Delia watched this and felt something she had no adequate word for, something that had to do with abundance and gratitude, and the specific miracle of getting to the thing you thought was out of reach. Calvin finished the partnership agreement with Thomas Vigil in March of 1888. It was a formal document, witnessed by Albert Rooney, establishing Thomas as an equal partner in the surveying practice with an equal share of contracts and profits. Thomas, who was 22 and had not expected this to happen for years, if it happened at all, stood in Rooney's office holding the document with an expression that Calvin recognized as the one Delia had described from the first evening at Mabel's cafe, the expression of someone trying not to show how much something matters to them. "You're worth it," Calvin said simply. "You've been worth it since the second month." Thomas folded the document with care. He looked at Calvin directly. "I'll work to keep being worth it," he said. "You'll succeed," Calvin said. And they shook hands, and that was the end of the ceremony and the beginning of the partnership being what it actually was. Vera and her husband James came to Redemption for a week in April of 1888. They had been in Albuquerque since the previous July and were, by Vera's assessment, surviving and mostly thriving. James had his business established, and Vera had found a church she liked, and a community she was settling into. She was 31, dark-haired, with the direct manner of someone who has always said what she meant and considered it a virtue. She and Delia sat in the kitchen of the house on the hill for 2 days while the children slept and the men took a surveying walk they had been planning. James had some land questions about a potential investment, and Calvin was the obvious person to ask, and they talked the way women talk when they have 4 years of lost time to recover. Vera said, "I thought about you constantly that first year. After you left, we all did, the ones who knew you before. We thought, is she safe, is she well, did she find somewhere?" "I found somewhere," Delia said. "You found," Vera gestured at the kitchen, the house, the window with its view of the territory. "Everything." "Not all at once," Delia said. It was, she paused, remembering, the saloon, the cold fear, the folded letter, a tall man standing up from a corner table. It required some specific things, of me and of the people who helped. "He came back, didn't he, Hargrove?" "He tried," Delia said. "And Calvin was there," she said simply. Vera looked at her with the particular intelligence of a woman who has known you for a long time and can read what the words don't say. "He saw you," Vera said. "What you actually were." "Yes," Delia said. "He saw me clearly from the very beginning, and that," she turned her coffee mug in her hands, "that was what starting over actually required, not just distance, not just time. Someone who could see what I was trying to become and not the story that had been told about me." Vera was quiet for a moment. "You're happy," she said, and it was not a question. "Deeply," Delia said, "specifically and thoroughly, which is different from how I expected happiness to feel." "How did you expect it to feel?" "I expected it to feel like relief," she said. "Like the end of difficulty, but it doesn't feel like the end of anything. It feels like," she thought of Calvin's grandfather's proposition, "the agreement between a person and the land. Like the beginning of everything I was supposed to be doing." The year 1889 was the year New Mexico Territory moved closer to statehood. The year Redemption built its second school building for the overflow of students, and the year that Delia Fairchild Bristol was appointed by the Territorial School Board as District Education Supervisor for the Southern Settlements, a position that was, as best anyone could determine, the first such appointment of a woman in the territory's history, and that Aldous Greer celebrated by standing up at the general town meeting and saying, with characteristic slow fairness, that it was about time. The appointment meant more travel, more writing, more meetings with the school board in Albuquerque, where Vera's presence was a continuing and particular pleasure. It meant Henry Ortega became the head teacher in Redemption, which he was ready for. It meant Frances Prescott, née Hollies, who had a schoolroom in her ranch house and had been teaching the children in the North settlements with unofficial but effective commitment, received formal recognition and funding, which she accepted with the dry understatement of someone who had been doing the work anyway and was mildly surprised it had taken this long to become official. Calvin came with Delia to Albuquerque when he could, which was more often than his schedule should have permitted, and which he managed by being very efficient with the time the schedule did permit. He sat in on one of her school board meetings in an unofficial capacity, and she watched him watching the board members and thought, he is cataloging the ones worth knowing and the ones to be careful of. He is doing for me, in this room, what he did in Harlan's saloon that first afternoon, being present, paying attention, making sure I know he is there without making it about him. Afterward they had dinner at a restaurant in Albuquerque that was considerably fancier than anything available in Redemption, and she told him this, and he said the food was not better, only more elaborately presented, and she agreed and ordered a second piece of pie. George started school in the fall of 1889, in the new building, in Henry Ortega's class. He was, by all reports and by his mother's somewhat biased assessment, an exceptional reader and a serious mathematician. He was also, by his teacher's more balanced assessment, a child who had very strong opinions about how things should be done, and who needed his opinions engaged with rather than dismissed, or he became argumentative. This, Henry told Delia at the fall conference, was not a problem he was complaining about. It was simply a characteristic to be worked with. He had the impression, he said carefully, that George had grown up in a household where people's opinions were taken seriously. Delia thought about that for several days. She brought it up with Calvin one evening in the kitchen, framed as a question. Had they done right by him, raising him the way they had? Were they creating a child who would struggle in a world that didn't always engage with opinions on their own terms? Calvin thought about it with the careful deliberateness she had always loved about him. I think we should keep doing what we've been doing, he said finally, and make sure he also learns that engaging with the world doesn't mean the world has to agree with you. That's different from suppressing the opinion. So we teach him to argue well instead of teaching him not to argue. Exactly. That seems like it could have interesting consequences. The most interesting consequences usually come from the most deliberate choices, Calvin said, and she agreed and went back to her correspondence. By 1890, Redemption had a proper hotel, a doctor with an actual medical degree from back east, and a telegraph line. The telegraph line was the one that mattered most to everyday life. The speed at which information could now move back and forth made Delia's work as district supervisor dramatically more efficient, and she used it with the focused intensity of someone who had learned, the hard way, that access to information was a form of power, and that power, in the right hands, could be used for good. She received a telegraph message in the spring of 1890 from Vera in Albuquerque, which read, HARGROVE wife left HIM. Heard through Commerce Society correspondence. Thought you should know. VERA. She showed it to Calvin. He read it and set it down. Are you thinking about it? He asked. She realized she wasn't. Not the way she might once have thought about anything related to Edmund, with the particular sharp vigilance of someone watching for danger. She was thinking about it abstractly, the way you think about a storm that passed years ago and whose damage has long since been repaired. I'm thinking about the woman who left him, she said. I hope she has somewhere to go. Calvin looked at her with the clear, direct attention that had been the defining quality of their relationship since its very first moment. You're not afraid of him anymore. I haven't been for some time, she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. The fear had dissolved so gradually she hadn't noticed its going, replaced incrementally by something more structural: confidence in her own standing, confidence in the life she had built, confidence in the man beside her. He was a dark chapter, she said. And then the book kept going. Calvin took the telegraph message, folded it, and put it in the wood stove. Then he put his arm around her and they stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the territory, at the land that stretched north and south and west in colors that still, 6 years in, had the power to stop her breath. Ellen was walking by April and running by June and had opinions about everything by August. George regarded her continued development with the same sustained, analytical attention he had been applying since her cradle days, and the two of them were developing a dynamic that amused their parents considerably: George serious and systematic, Ellen intuitive and unpredictable, both of them fundamentally certain they were correct about everything, and both of them, frequently and infuriatingly, right. They built the final addition to the house in the summer of 1890, a wide porch that ran along the south side, facing the valley and the long view toward the settlement south of Redemption. It was Calvin's design and Delia's specification. She had wanted, for years, somewhere to sit in the evening with a clear view of the sky. It was Thomas Vigil who helped construct it, working over 3 weekends with the quiet efficiency of a man who builds things carefully and takes satisfaction in a result that will last. When it was done, they sat on it the first evening, the 4 of them: Calvin, Delia, George with his book, Ellen with her collection of interesting rocks, and the sky performed its ordinary, extraordinary performance, and Delia looked at it all and felt the weight of the feeling she had first encountered in the schoolroom that first morning. The feeling of being herself, fully, without qualification, without someone else's version of her imposed over the top. Just herself in her life in the territory she had chosen, in the house on the hill. "Look," George said, very seriously, pointing at a hawk riding a thermal above the valley. They all looked. "That's a red-tailed hawk," Calvin said. "See how the tail catches the sun." "I know," George said with the patience of someone who has been told this before. "I read about them. It says they mate for life." Delia looked at Calvin. He looked at her. Something moved between them, wordless and complete, the way the best things between two people are. "That's true," Calvin said. "They do." Ellen held up a piece of quartz she had found at the edge of the porch, the afternoon light making it glow faintly pink. "Pretty," she announced, with the particular confidence of someone stating a fact. "Very pretty," Delia agreed. The hawk turned on the thermal and lifted, higher and higher, until it was a dark point against the enormous blue of the territory sky, and then it found its direction and flew north, purposeful and unhurried, toward whatever it was going. Delia thought about starting over. She thought about the train platform in St. Louis with 1 trunk and $63, and a heart full of terror and something harder and cleaner underneath it. She thought about arriving in a town she hadn't planned to stop in and recognizing something in it that felt like it was hers. She thought about a letter hitting a saloon floor and a tall man standing up from a corner table. She thought about what starting over had actually required. Not the absence of difficulty. There had been plenty of difficulty. Not the guarantee of a clean, uncomplicated path. What it had required was the willingness to keep going, the clarity to see what was worth fighting for and what was worth letting go, and the particular grace of finding, in the middle of the fight, someone who could see her clearly and was not afraid of what they saw. She reached over and took Calvin's hand, the way she had on the creek bank the first time, that May evening in 1884 when the wildflowers were along the water, and the sky was doing 17 colors, and something between them pressed at the edges of whatever distance they'd been keeping. He held her hand with the same steady warmth he had held it with every time since. The territory was enormous around them. The evening was coming in from the east, the last gold fading from the scrub and the rock and the pale, dry grass of the valley. George had set down his book and was watching the sky. Ellen had accumulated a small collection of rocks on the porch beside her and was arranging them by color with the serious concentration of a scientist. It was an ordinary evening in Redemption, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1890. It was the most extraordinary life Delia Fairchild had ever imagined. She had come to the territory to start over. She had found a man who understood, without being told, without being asked, simply understood in the way that certain people understand certain things, because their own experience has made them fluent in it. That starting over was not a single event but a continuous practice. That it required witness and patience, and the particular generosity of someone who could sit with another person's dark past without flinching from it, or weaponizing it, or making it into a reason to run. That it required, above all, the willingness to let someone be more than the story that had been told about them. He had given her all of that from the first afternoon. She had given him the same in return, as she had come to understand over years of marriage and partnership, and the slow, honest work of two people building something together. That he had needed it too. That his own chapter of difficulty, the thing that had made him stand up in that saloon when he had no practical reason to, the thing that had made him recognize the trap she was in because he had, in a different way, seen it before, had required from her exactly what she had learned to give. They were, she thought, watching the stars come up one by one over the territory, precisely what the other had needed. Not in the romantic, breathless, impossible sense that novels sometimes described, and that she had once believed was what love was supposed to feel like, but in the actual sense, two people with real histories and real damage and real strength who had found each other in the middle of a frontier town in 1884 and had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately and with full knowledge of what choosing meant, to stay, to build, to be honest with each other about what the building required. "Calvin," she said. "Yes," he said without looking away from the sky. "Thank you for standing up that day." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for not thanking me too much afterward," he said, "for not making me into something larger than I was. It made it easier for me to become something worth being." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The stars continued their ancient, patient business above Redemption. The town below the hill was settling into evening, the lamplight coming on in windows, the ordinary sounds of a place that was alive and growing and full of people with their own stories, and their own starting overs, and their own dark pasts that the territory was absorbing and reshaping with its particular, ancient indifference to where anyone had come from. It only cared about where you were standing now. Delia was standing here, on this porch in this life, with this man and these children and this view of the enormous, unheld sky. 6 years from the train platform. 6 years from the terror and the $63 and the ferocious refusal to become what someone else had designed for her. Starting over had required everything. She had given everything, and the territory had given back more. Ellen fell asleep with her rocks still arranged in their careful rows beside her, and Calvin lifted her without waking her and carried her inside, and George, who was 8 years old and thoroughly convinced of his own grown-up status, stayed on the porch with his mother for another few minutes watching the last color leave the sky. "Mama," he said. "Yes. Were you ever somewhere before here?" She looked at him, this serious, dark-haired boy with her eyes and his father's way of asking questions that went directly to the thing. "Yes," she said. "A long way east, a city." "Why did you leave?" She considered him carefully. He was 8 and he was asking an 8-year-old's version of a real question, and he deserved a real answer at an 8-year-old's scale. "Because I needed to find out who I actually was," she said, "and I couldn't do that where I was." He thought about this. "Did you find out?" "I did," she said, "right here." He accepted this with the nod of someone who finds the answer sufficient, and then he went inside to go to bed, and Delia sat alone on the porch for another few minutes in the complete quiet of the territory night, with the stars brilliant overhead and the smell of sage on the cooling air and the faint creak sound from below the hill. Then she got up and went inside to the life she had built, and closed the door behind her.